family name, a world watching. There is a strange kind of pressure that comes from sharing a last name with a legend. For nearly 3 decades, one member of the Jackson family carried that weight quietly, waiting for the right moment to step into a spotlight the whole world already had trained on his family. That moment finally arrived when Jaafar Jackson was cast to play his late uncle, Michael Jackson, in the biographical film simply titled Michael. What followed was not an overnight success story but a grinding, multi-year transformation that turned a little-known singer into one of the most talked-about new faces in Hollywood. Before we go further, picture this for a second. Imagine growing up knowing that any attempt you make at a music or acting career will always be compared to the most famous entertainer who ever lived, and that comparison happens to be your own uncle. Would you run from that shadow or lean into it? Jaafar chose to lean in, and the results reshaped his entire life. Born into the legacy, Jaafar Jeremiah Jackson came into the world in Los Angeles in the summer of 1996, the son of Jermaine Jackson, an original member of the Jackson 5, and Alejandra Genevieve Oaziaza, who was born in Bogotá, Colombia. Growing up as part of a sprawling family with 11 siblings, Jaafar was raised inside the strange mix of privilege and pressure that comes with being a Jackson. He was raised in a Muslim household, and years later, in 2020, he traveled to Saudi Arabia to perform Umrah, sharing glimpses of that pilgrimage with fans online. Unlike some children of famous families who chase headlines early, Jaafar mostly avoided the tabloid circuit. He did appear as a cast member on his family's reality series in the mid-2010s, but for the most part he stayed out of the public conversation, choosing instead to quietly build toward a career of his own. That patience turned out to be the first sign of the discipline that would later define his approach to the role of a lifetime. Here's a question worth sitting with. How many people would have the restraint to wait years for the right opportunity instead of trying to force their way into the spotlight using a famous surname? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Building a career in music first. Long before anyone discussed him playing Michael Jackson on screen, Jaafar was focused on music. In 2019, he released his debut single, a soulful R&B track called Got Me Singing, built around smooth vocals and a classic sound that echoed his family's musical roots without trying to imitate any one relative directly. He continued releasing music rooted in soul and R&B rather than chasing whatever trend was dominating streaming charts at the time. None of these songs became runaway hits, but that never seemed to be the point. Jaafar treated each release as another step in developing his own artistic voice, performing in smaller venues and refining his sound one project at a time. Acting was not part of the plan. He was building a career as a singer on his own terms when an opportunity arrived that would completely redirect his path. The role of a lifetime. In January 2023, it was announced that Jaafar Jackson would portray his uncle Michael Jackson in a long-in-development biopic directed by Antoine Fuqua, the filmmaker behind Training Day and The Equalizer. The casting news traveled fast, in part because it seemed almost inevitable given the family connection, and in part because skeptics immediately questioned whether the role had been handed to him simply because of his last name. The reality was more complicated. Reports at the time indicated that nearly 2,000 actors were considered for the part before Jaafar was chosen, and he still had to prove through auditions and screen tests that he could carry a film of this scale. His own grandmother, Catherine Jackson, publicly voiced her approval of the casting, saying that he embodied her son and that it was meaningful to see him carrying on the family's legacy of entertainers. What do you imagine that first audition must have felt like? Walking into a room knowing that millions of fans already have a fixed picture in their minds of exactly how Michael Jackson moved, spoke, and performed? That is the kind of pressure Jaafar was stepping into. 2 years of transformation. Once cast, Jaafar entered what can only be described as an exhaustive, multi-year preparation process. He worked with vocal coaches and movement specialists to rebuild the way he walked, spoke, danced, and carried himself on stage. According to interviews given during the film's press tour, he described needing to find an acting coach and to genuinely learn the craft of acting, since this was his debut performance in a film. Part of that preparation reportedly involved spending time at the Jackson family's former Encino estate, immersing himself in the environment where Michael grew from a child star into a global phenomenon. Rather than only rehearsing choreography from old concert footage, Jaafar apparently studied interview tapes at reduced speed to catch subtle mannerisms, small verbal habits, and shifts in tone that a casual viewer would likely never notice. Table reads with the cast, guided by Fuqua, were described as feeling closer to serious theater workshops than a typical film rehearsal. The most technically demanding element of that preparation was almost certainly the moonwalk, a move so recognizable that even a slightly imperfect version would have been noticed instantly by longtime fans. Jaafar reportedly broke the movement down piece by piece, studying the shifting weight and timing until it stopped looking rehearsed and started to feel natural. If you have ever tried to learn even a simple dance move by watching videos online, you already know how humbling that process can be. Now imagine doing it under the assumption that any mistake will be dissected by millions of viewers who grew up watching the original. A transformation the camera could not ignore. Alongside the physical and vocal training came an equally demanding transformation in appearance. Academy Award-winning makeup designer Bill Corso led the process of recreating Michael Jackson's look on screen, working with prosthetics and styling that were built around Jaafar's own facial structure rather than masking it entirely. Because of the family resemblance, the team reportedly needed far less extreme alteration than might normally be required for this kind of transformation. By the time filming was underway, getting into character each day involved hours in the makeup chair before a single scene was shot. Crew members have described being genuinely startled the first time they saw the finished look in full costume, saying it momentarily became difficult to remember they were looking at Jaafar rather than at archival footage of Michael himself. A production that faced its own challenges. The path to release was not smooth. Early drafts of the screenplay reportedly included material addressing the child sexual abuse allegations made against Michael Jackson later in his career, along with a dramatized sequence depicting the 1993 police raid on the Neverland Ranch estate. That material was ultimately removed, partly because of a legal restriction tied to a settlement with one of the accusers barring his depiction in film or television. The production went through reshoots in mid-2025 that reportedly added tens of millions of dollars to an already substantial budget, which climbed to around $200 million. Funded jointly by Lionsgate, Universal, and the Jackson estate. Because of that rewrite, the finished film focuses on Michael's rise from the Jackson 5 through the beginning of his solo career, closing around the Bad World Tour in 1988, rather than covering the full arc of his later life and controversies. Critics have been divided over that choice, with several reviews describing the film as an incomplete or overly favorable account of a complicated public figure. It currently holds a Rotten Tomatoes score in the high 30% range, reflecting that split reception. That raises an interesting question for anyone who has followed Michael Jackson's career. Can a biopic be considered a fair portrait of someone's life if it deliberately leaves out the most controversial chapters? Feel free to share your own take in the comments. A box office story that silenced the doubters. Whatever critics thought, audiences responded in overwhelming numbers. Michael opened domestically on April 24, 2026 to roughly $97 million, and around $217 million worldwide in its first weekend alone, obliterating the previous opening record for a music biopic set a decade earlier by Straight Outta Compton. It also recorded the biggest opening ever for a musical biopic in IMAX theaters. The film kept climbing from there. Within weeks, it had already outpaced the total domestic run of Bohemian Rhapsody, the Freddie Mercury biopic long considered the benchmark for this genre. By early summer, Michael had crossed the worldwide total of Bohemian Rhapsody to become the highest-grossing music biopic ever made, and shortly after that, it surpassed even Oppenheimer to become the highest-grossing biopic centered on a real person in box office history, with a combined domestic and international total approaching $1 billion. It also became the single highest-grossing release in Lionsgate's history, ahead of blockbuster franchises the studio had relied on for over a decade. Given how divided the reviews were, that level of commercial success is genuinely remarkable. What does it say about audience appetite for Michael Jackson's story, more than 15 years after his death, that people turned out in these numbers despite lukewarm critical reception? Life beyond the screen. Away from the film set, Jaafar has spent nearly a decade in a relationship with singer Maddie Simpson, whom he began dating in 2016. The two made their relationship public 2 years later at a musical event honoring producer Quincy Jones, and have remained together since, with Simpson repeatedly expressing pride in his commitment to the role online. Reports indicate the couple became engaged in early 2025, with a proposal that reportedly involved a striking yellow diamond ring, followed by an intimate engagement celebration with close family and friends. Simpson, herself a singer with roots in soul and R&B, has appeared alongside Jaafar at premieres in Berlin, Los Angeles, and Gary, Indiana, supporting him throughout the film's global rollout. A legacy still being written. Following the film's massive commercial performance, Lionsgate confirmed in May 2026 that a sequel focused on the later chapters of Michael Jackson's life was already in development, with director Antoine Fuqua indicating that enough additional footage exists to support it. For Jaafar, a role that began as an enormous gamble, stepping away from a modest music career into the most scrutinized acting debut imaginable, has instead become the foundation of what looks like a lasting career in film. Looking back at everything it took to get here, the years of vocal coaching, the physical transformation, the risk of public failure, and the reshoots that reshaped the entire project, it is worth asking what you think history will ultimately say about this performance. Was this simply a family member with the right last name in the right place? Or did Jaafar Jackson genuinely earn his place as the actor who brought one of music's most complicated legends back to the screen? Share your thoughts below, and if you enjoyed this look behind the making of Michael, let us know which part of the story surprised you the most. From doubt to global attention, skepticism followed Jaafar long before the film ever reached theaters. Because he shared both a surname and a striking physical resemblance with his uncle, plenty of commentators assumed the casting decision was more about bloodline than talent. That kind of doubt is common whenever a relative of a legendary figure steps into a role tied so closely to that legacy, and it placed an extra burden on Jaafar to prove himself in front of a camera for the very first time in his life. Rather than respond to the criticism directly, he let the preparation speak for itself. Interviews from the production describe a performer who treated every rehearsal as a chance to close the gap between imitation and genuine embodiment, focusing less on hitting familiar poses from famous photographs and more on understanding the emotional reasoning behind each gesture. That distinction between copying a legend and understanding one may be the clearest explanation for why so many people who watched early footage described the performance as unexpectedly convincing. Would you have handled that kind of public skepticism the same way, by staying quiet and letting the work speak for itself? Or would you have felt the need to defend yourself publicly before the film even came out? A trailer that broke records of its own. Long before opening weekend arrived, the marketing rollout for Michael gave an early hint of just how much attention the project had generated. When Lionsgate released the first teaser trailer in November 2025, built around a montage of some of Michael Jackson's biggest hits, it reportedly reached more than 30 million views within 6 hours, and surpassed 116 million views in its first full day online. That made it the biggest trailer debut in Lionsgate's history, and it reportedly outperformed every previous trailer for a musical biopic or concert film, including the widely viewed rollout for Taylor Swift's Eras Tour concert film. Numbers like that mean more than simple marketing buzz. For a film built around a single actor's ability to carry an entire legacy, that level of anticipation meant the pressure had officially moved from private rehearsal rooms into full public view. Every frame Jaafar appeared in that teaser was instantly slowed down, screenshotted, and picked apart online by longtime fans comparing his mannerisms directly against footage of Michael Jackson from decades earlier. A global rollout and $1 billion question Michael premiered in Berlin in April 2026 before opening across the United States in IMAX theaters on April 24th. Distribution was split between Lionsgate in North America and Universal Pictures internationally, with separate regional partnerships in Russia and Japan. As the film expanded into additional territories through the summer, including a delayed Japanese release, industry watchers speculated openly about whether it might become only the second film that year, after an animated blockbuster sequel, to cross the billion-dollar mark worldwide. That kind of speculation says something about how far the film traveled beyond its original core audience of longtime Michael Jackson fans. A biopic centered on a single artist's discography and life story rarely reaches numbers typically reserved for franchise blockbusters. Yet Michael managed to sit in the same conversation as some of the biggest global releases of the year. Here's something worth considering. Do you think a sequel covering the more difficult, controversial chapters of Michael Jackson's later life could match this same level of box office success? Or does the sanitized approach of the first film explain a meaningful part of why audiences turned out in such large numbers? Talking about the process in public. As the press tour ramped up, Jaafar became noticeably more open about the unconventional methods behind his preparation. During an appearance promoting the film alongside co-stars Coleman Domingo, who played Joe Jackson, and the young actor cast as a childhood version of Michael, Jaafar discussed drawing inspiration from his uncle's personal writings, including notebooks, handwritten reflections, and daily affirmations, material that reportedly offered him insight into Michael's mindset that choreography alone could never provide. In a separate late-night appearance, he reflected on how quickly the intensity of the production ramped up once filming began, describing early days on set that involved long hours of repetition until even the smallest physical details became automatic. He also spoke about needing to formally study acting for the first time in his life once he accepted the role, since his background up to that point had been almost entirely in music rather than film. Those conversations gave viewers a rare look at just how much of the transformation happened away from the cameras, in notebooks, in vocal coaching sessions, and in quiet hours spent absorbing archival material most casual fans have never seen. A story still unfolding. Whatever verdict history eventually reaches on this performance, one fact is difficult to dispute. An actor with no previous film credits stepped into arguably the most scrutinized biographical role of the decade and came out the other side starring in the highest-grossing biopic ever made. Whether that outcome reflects genuine talent, an extraordinary work ethic, favorable family circumstances, or some combination of all three, is a debate that will likely continue for years. If you have made it this far, consider leaving a comment with your own take on Jaafar Jackson's performance, and let us know whether you plan to watch the announced sequel once it eventually reaches theaters.